This interactive video is going to be about the Belmont Report. We talked a bit about that before, but we'll get into it a little bit more here. And the Bioethical Principles, which are respect for autonomy, beneficence, and justice. So, as a reminder, since we've been so deep into ethical theory for the past few weeks, bioethics is the application of ethics to the field of medicine and healthcare. So ethicists and bioethicists ask relevant questions more than provide sure and certain answers. Just deepen and broaden the argument and attempt to cover as many bases as possible to ensure that emotions and self-interest aren't kind of hijacking the issue, right? So some examples of bioethical issues are PEDs in sports, human organ selling, genetic engineering and enhancement, physician-assisted suicide, prisoner experimentation, and vaccine distribution. So again, the Belmont Report was the product of a conference that was held in 1978. And the conference was comprised of physicians, nurses, hospital administrators, researchers, philosophers, lawyers, clergy, samples, representatives from all across the board who had something to weigh in on this with. I mean, like, what should we do? We've hit a crisis that needs to be addressed in the way that we treat human subjects of research. And this was partially in response to the Tuskegee untreated syphilis experiment, but also the Nuremberg trials, the Nazi trials, right? Coming from the Nazi medical experiments. So the conclusion of this study, this conference, was the Belmont Report, or the product of it. And the Belmont Report summarizes ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects. And those are respect for autonomy, beneficence, and justice. And these principles draw from philosophical ethical theory, like we just studied, and they're the basis for the United States Department of Health and Human Services human subject protection regulations. And they're also recognized and applied when considering any kind of bioethical controversy, even those that don't revolve around testing in human subjects. So what I wanted to, it's a cool way to think about this, right? Imagine that there's any given bioethical controversy, bio problem, right? Should we or shouldn't we do X, let's say? Well, the bioethical principles are there to kind of cover the different perspectives that are inherently involved in bioethical decision-making, medical decision-making. Certainly, medical decision-making involves the patient, right? Or the individual perspective, the individual human subject or patient. Right? And medical decision-making, to be a patient, you have to be somebody's patient. You got the healthcare professional here putting a mask on, even though everybody... Now, where's the mask? Put some eyes. Okay. So, doctor, healthcare professional, the conductor of the researcher, right? There's the patient or the subject, the doctor or physician or healthcare team. They have a different angle on bioethical problems. And then there's the social aspect of bioethical issues, right? So, because the decisions we make surrounding medicine and what can and can't be done and what ought to be done and ought not to be done affects the individual patients, right? Affects the physicians and the the care providers and their practices and their oaths, and it also affects society in general. So the Belmont Report and the Commission recognized this throughout the conference. It said, well, then we need three principles, one per perspective, right? So hopefully that made sense. So the first one is respect for autonomy, and that emphasizes the patient or the subject in the study, or the individual, the one receiving the potential care. And that says that's composed of like different aspects, right? The first is autonomy. Individuals should be treated as autonomous agents capable of making their own decisions regarding their health, and people with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. So, first, it's that, hey, it's my body, it's my life. I may not be an expert, but I can learn some stuff about my condition or this study or whatever it is. And I don't want people making all the decisions for me. I want some say regarding my own health. And I need that to be honored. And also that people with diminished autonomy need some protection. That would be like the elderly and infirm, right? So the principle of respect for autonomy says you have to treat people with respect and respect their wishes, and you have to respect the fact that some people have diminished autonomy and they need a little bit of help, and also, more importantly, you can't exploit them. Don't treat them like tools because they aren't capable as other people any longer, right? The diminished autonomy can be for whatever reason. Sometimes it's youth, sometimes it's age, and a multitude of reasons. But this principle states clearly that they are entitled to protection from exploitation. Also, informed consent. So autonomy is based upon informed consent. And that means that patients and individuals must be made aware of the full range of options available to them, the risks and benefits, information comprehension, voluntariness. This is critical. So, in other words, let's imagine you were going to volunteer for a study of some new like antidepressant medication or something. They can't just say to you, oh, if you participate, you're gonna earn $1,000 and you'll get a bunch of medical care top to bottom. You'll even get a functional MRI. You'll get aftercare for this long. It'll be great. They have to tell you what the risks are too. You need the full range of information, as much information as you can take. You gotta get it. So you can't give consent to anything until you're fully informed, is a component of the respect for autonomy principle. And then also truth-telling. Seems obvious enough, but you'd be surprised. Don't intentionally deceive or coerce people in order to get what you want out of them or make them more compliant. 100% honesty. So that's the first bioethical principle. Next, it's beneficence, and that emphasizes the physician or the researcher or the nurse or the healthcare professional in this equation, right? It emphasizes their perspective. So there was a philosopher named William Frankena who outlined 4 elements of this principle, and sometimes it's referred to as the principle of beneficence / non-maleficence. It's a mouthful, right? Do good, don't do bad. It's good enough. And that breaks down into like the components of the Hippocratic Oath, essentially. One ought not to inflict evil or harm. One ought to prevent evil or harm. One ought to remove evil or harm, and one ought to do or promote good. So this is supposed to, if there is a bioethical controversy, keeping this principle in mind is meant to keep the physician's perspective in mind. They've taken an oath. They've been trained in certain ways, right? And sometimes we can lose sight of that. For instance, if we're just looking out for ourselves as a patient or a subject of a study, I want this, I want that, I know what's good for me. Well, they have perspectives too that differ unless you are a physician or a nurse or a researcher, you don't have the same information and training as them. Their perspective matters incredibly. You couldn't be a patient or a subject were it not for them, right? So this is critical. And I already hinted to this, but as a note, this principle, the principle of beneficence, is often broken down into beneficence and non-maleficence. But because we unpack the principle the way we just did above, we'll just keep them grouped together. We're just going to call it beneficence, right? In the principle of beneficence, non-maleficence is implied. Let's put it that way. Strongly implied. And then there's justice, which emphasizes society as a whole. So you have then respect for autonomy, the individual's perspective, beneficence, the healthcare worker perspective, and then justice is the social tries to take into account social ramifications and a social perspective. So here are some stipulations of justice. Resources are sometimes scarce, and the principle of justice is intended to ensure equal distribution of them. Something pops to mind pretty clearly here. The principle of justice requires that social benefits, like healthcare services, and social burdens, like taxes or even experimentation, be distributed in accordance with the demands of justice. Benefits and burdens. The benefits can't go only to one group at the expense of another, is an easy way to put it. And an injustice occurs when some benefit to which a person or group is entitled is denied without good reason, or when some burden is imposed unduly upon some person or group. We'll see this principle rearing its head pretty clearly in the future. And we'll see all of them rearing their heads pretty clearly in the future. So quickly, here's an example of a bioethical argument that emphasizes respect for autonomy. Now, before I go into that, controversies arise so the idea is that when you're generating an argument on a bioethical issue, either in favor of something or against something, the point is to try to keep, like I've mentioned before, you keep all of those principles like you're juggling them. Try to keep them all in the air, right? They are equally important. The idea is that one should not rear its head and dominate the others. All three of them need to be kept active in consideration in any argument. But what happens is that as you read bioethical arguments, you can kind of see what the author thinks is more important in any given issue, right? You can see that, okay, they're trying to acknowledge respect for autonomy, beneficence, and justice, but they're really favoring justice here, or they're really favoring respect for persons, or respect for autonomy or beneficence here. That happens. Right? So here's an example of a bioethical argument emphasizing respect for autonomy, just so you can see how it pops. Organ sales should be legal. That's the conclusion. Well, how come? The donor and the recipient have free will. They accept the transaction with a complete understanding of the risks and benefits involved, and no one has the right to tell people what they can and can't do with their own body. Notice, this is pretty much all respect for autonomy. There's no beneficence or justice perspective in this argument. But sometimes when you look at them and you in their like pure state, it's easier to tease out later when we're reading real bioethical arguments where they're trying to keep all three in play. Here's an example of a bioethical argument emphasizing beneficence. Same issue. There is obviously some harm done to the donor in the surgery involved in organ donation. There is also immediate exposure to surgical risks, disfigurement, and loss of an organ. However, these risks of harm are so well defined in the kidney transplant process that donors can be assured that the risks, both long and short term, are minimal. On the other hand, the risks associated with the liver, lung, and pancreas donation process are not as well defined. Perhaps there should be a moratorium on these donations until the risks can be carefully assessed. And then here we have, down here, this is the conclusion. A soft conclusion, but hopefully you can see how this even it sounds like it's coming from the perspective of a physician. This is a beneficence-centered bioethical argument. And then here's one that emphasizes justice. Same issue. The main benefit of payments for organ procurement would undoubtedly go to relatively privileged individuals who could afford it. They would get transplants more readily than others, in addition to all the other privileges that accrue to the wealthy: better homes to recuperate in, healthcare, service, etc. Obviously, paid donation is not a solution to the organ availability crisis. So this argument is emphasizing the bioethical principle of justice. It's saying, hey, if we allow people to buy and sell kidneys, they're going to come from the poor to benefit the rich. That means the social group of the poor are burdened to the benefit of the rich, and this is a disturbance in justice, for instance. Just a for instance here. Okay, so topics covered. We got the Belmont Report and the Bioethical Principles. And this should say, autonomy. It's called different things in different textbooks. The way I was taught this and learned it and have taught it was that it was called respect for persons, but the readings I chose for our class are calling it respect for autonomy, so that's the way we're going. So the bioethical principles of respect for autonomy, beneficence, and justice.